For now over a century of Beowulf scholarship, discussion on meter has primarily used the five-type system of Edward Sievers. It's taught in most introductory grammars and many editions of Beowulf, including the Kleber 4, modified slightly by the work of Alan Bliss. And it often appears to the student of Old English as a sort of divine law. Is this system as airtight as it seems? What are its limitations when working with Beowulf?
Well, it's not, it's very useful when working with Beowulf, and it was the basis of my work. Uh, the five type system is uh, sort of halfway toward a theory, but it isn't a theory. It's a classification. That's completely different. Roman Jakobson, the famous Prague linguist, as he said, a theory of meter is a meter that identifies something that is true of all verses, like iambic pentameter, dactylic hexameter. They're divided into 5 or 6 feet, and each foot has a predominant rhythm. So those are true of the departures are departures within this basic structure, but the structure applies to every verse in the Iliad or every verse in Shakespeare. Sievers never discovered anything like that, and my goal was to discover what it was, what the metrical constant was. That's what Jakobson calls the thing or things that hold true in every verse in a poem. Uh, Now, the thing is, so what Sievers did was if you imagine Sievers working with note cards and putting one verse on each card, he sorted them into categories. And he found big categories, for example, with type A1. So he said, this is obviously okay. And if you're editing a poem, this is obviously okay. Sievers discovered that by sorting. Uh, and the categories he identified cover enough verses so that as far as it goes, it's very reliable to an editor of any Old English poem. So he discovered what kinds of things are obviously okay. And one of the scientific achievement was he found a lot of things that looked kind of crazy, but became perfect members of these classes that are obviously okay if you assume that two short syllables equal one long syllable and occupy one of the four metrical positions that you usually have, or five. Um, that's the rule of resolution. He also discovered that something that looked weird belonged to one of the good categories if you assumed it counted as the archaic form, the form that existed just before Old English, like before certain kinds of contraction happened, that will give you the other syllable you need to make it regular, or before certain kinds of added vowels messed up the made it look weird. So the fact that he discovered these three ways of correcting things that look strange that were perfectly logical and based on linguistic fact, nothing to do with him. He didn't fudge that. Uh, is uh, that's the kind of thing where the exception actually proves the rule to be valid,
Right.
not just tests it, probot. So I don't at all sympathize with people who say that metrics is no good because metrics disagree with one another.
Mhm.
Really, in the case of Old English meter, we disagree with one another within very narrow limits, almost everybody now. So there's nothing wrong with Sievers as far as it goes, but it doesn't do very well in certain kinds of verses, that he wants to exclude, but which occur in, uh, like 25 times and similar in their linguistic structure. They don't fit, they like the ones that have seem to have five metrical positions. He'd like to have a rule that the verse has four metrical positions, but there's some of the so-called expanded D type that have five. And there's no way to get rid of these that's comparable to resolution or decontraction or uh, preopenthesis. No way to get rid of them. So that's the limitation, but it's a very narrow limitation. And there's no reason to doubt that K4 is a wonderful scholarly achievement.
For sure. Yeah. So for the sake of the viewers, I'm thinking Sievers does allow us to look at a verse like Thara tendra and
Hmm.
say that the Thara is probably not an original aspect of the verse because then it would be an invalid D type. So, we can't have anacrusis on a B verse before
Hmm.
tendra. But then in a line like Maton merefloras, that matone, there's a dip in between the first and second
Hmm.
lift, right? So there's no kind of comfortable way to use Sievers' system to explain that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it tells you, it tells you very reliably when something is totally okay, but it doesn't explain why.
Hmm.
So what I mean, my own work began by wanting to find a Jakobsonian constant. Paul Kiparsky told me when I was in graduate school to read Jakobson, his selected writings, and I did. I said, "Oh, where's the metrical constant?" And actually, I didn't work systematically towards having an idea. I don't know if anybody ever does that, but I was reading Claver 3 one day, and I turned the page, and I had a kind of hallucination. It seemed to me that every verse had two words in it. And then I looked again, and of course, that wasn't the case. But it was the case so often that I was intrigued. And at that point, I was learning Old Irish because it was another uh, uh, precious survival of Iron Age culture, which I was interested in independently of the meter as an old sort of folklore, folky type person. And Travis, he's the one who invented the term word foot meter. Because there are Irish meters in which you have exactly a certain number of words in the line. And in some of them, nothing else is true. In others, the rhythm can change, but you have to use it twice in a row at least in a run. But once I saw that, and it was after I'd had this hallucination, it seemed to me that well, I've been possessed by that idea ever since, and it's never misled me. Nor has generative linguistics ever misled me. Kiparsky's work was terribly important on iambic pentameter, looking not just at what the predominant rhythm was, but exactly how it's realized with linguistic material.
For viewers unfamiliar with Kiparsky, because we've mentioned him a couple times now, could you explain who he was, what his career kind of looked like, what he contributed?
Yeah, he graduated with the first class of PhD candidates from Noam Chomsky's brand new program in generative linguistics at MIT. He was in the first group, and I met him that was 1965. I met him in between 1968 and 1972 when I was in the English, I was getting an English PhD, and I would have gotten a linguistics PhD too if I hadn't got a job at Brown, which was, I was I was out of there at that point. But the curious thing that happened was that uh, I was selected by the new linguistics program, the new generative linguistics program at Stony Brook, where I was, as their first TA because they had no other source of TAs. So I learned generative linguistics while gradually realizing that my interest in poetic form, which had been since I was a child, that this was the way I could answer my questions. All through my undergraduate career, except for philosophy courses like Donald Davidson's, uh, when I asked, you know, a professor question that intrigued me, I was told that that was real complicated and it was way too hard. And, young people resist things like this. So that was part of it too. Uh, but so I thought, well, the metrical constant isn't exactly two words, but you can divide every verse into 2 feet with the pattern of with each foot having the pattern of an Old English word. And that was the starting point. But now that's that invention of Travis's is not mine, and I would like to replace it with universalist theory because I'm now deriving systematically, rules for for resolution and rules for uh, enjambment, breaking
Mhm.
the syntax with the boundary of the line. Um, I'm deriving the rules for metrical positions from syllables, the rules for metrical feet from rules for words in the native language, and rules for verses and lines from rules for phrases and sentences in the natural language. And
Right.
the trick there, the reason you can verify this is the other assumption I make, which is that uh, metrical positions, feet, and verses and lines are not just derived from any old linguistic constituent. They correspond to the typical ones, the most familiar ones, the most common ones. And departure from the norms for the linguistic constituent cause metrical complexity. And the thing about that is like your typical word is trochaic. That's the basic privileged foot. When you depart from that, you get complexity. And you can measure complexity because it inhibits the use of a verse toward the end of a line or toward the end of a verse clause. So the universalist system just says for any meter, you derive your units of meter from units of language and from and the norms for the metrical units correspond to the norms for the linguistic units. Exactly. Not just kind of, but precisely. And this makes a whole lot of predictions, all of which can be tested.
Right.
And it's pretty easy to test them once you think of doing it.
Mhm.
And so far as I can see, it works perfectly. When it doesn't seem to, I've just misformulated some rule. That's the way I make progress. I see, oh, that shouldn't be the case. Oh, I can change that and then everything's fine. And usually when I change it, it becomes more plausible than it was before, in addition to being more accurate. So I kind of envy people who can have ideas, like you could do that if you wanted. It seems to me that the ideas have me. I mean, I'm possessed by them.
Right.
I do live a normal life. I'm disciplined that way, but I can't leave this stuff alone, and I really enjoy it.
For sure. I want to talk a lot about the universalist theory, but before we do that, another term that I think might be helpful to define is generative linguistics. How would you describe generative linguistics?
Well, The structuralists and behaviorists who talked about language before, they studied linguistic behavior. That was the name of Skinner's book that Chomsky completely blew out of the water at the beginning of generative linguistics. Um, they told you if you were interviewing somebody in a South American jungle culture and their language had never been decoded before, don't ask them to tell you what they mean. Just observe them and make your own conclusions. Well, it became clear to the people actually working in the field that that never worked. You had to get to the point where you could ask people questions with gestures and then keep doing that and get into their minds. So one of the big differences with generative linguistics is you imagine yourself as the native speaker and you have to use your own intuitions. So Chomsky started with English because, as he said, I control the data. That is, I can ask myself what I would say and what I would never say. Completely different way of thinking. So what you do is to invent rules to explain your own intuitions about could I ever say I bagels like? No, I couldn't. I have to say I like bagels. I have a subject verb object language. I know that about myself. I know that for sure. And I know a whole lot of stuff about pronunciation that I don't know I know, but that can be discovered. For example, everybody knows how to form a regular plural of an English word, but you have to be a linguist, I think, to know that it's pronounced s after a voiceless consonant, z after a voiced consonant or a vowel, except for the things that are too much like s and would cause the s to be lost by assimilation, like churches, hisses, s, hisses. How do you put a simple s on hiss? You don't. Becomes hiss, you lose the ending. So there are rules, and the rules for past tenses. Do you say T or D for the past tense? I slept. I goaded him. It's the same kind of rule as the one for the S. So you can use you just by looking into your own mind, uh, by consulting your intuitions, as Donald Davidson used to say in philosophy classes, uh, you can discover a lot of things about language. But you have to know how to start, and it's not obvious, so you have to read some linguistics to get
Right.
started. Uh, the other thing is, once Chomsky sort of did these thought experiments with his native language, he started to want other people to do that with their native languages and get to the point where you eliminated arbitrary rules for a single language and started to see what the human language faculty was like, what the starting point was for acquisition of a language by children. And his point was that children learn language so easily, so much more easily than adults learn new languages, that the starting point had to be pretty well defined. The child had to have quite a lot of fancy mental equipment to acquire a language in the way that they did. So the ultimate goal of the project is to describe uh, the human linguistic faculty. Now, the thing about poetry is that there's hardly been any culture discovered, and no culture big enough to really have uh, records from the past that is without what anybody would call poetry with rules. So the same thing arises with that. How in the world can you like iambic pentameter, right? You like
Yeah, for
Shakespeare?
sure. Yeah, I love Shakespeare.
Now somebody misrecited a line by Shakespeare, like uh, said be neither a borrower nor a lender instead of neither a borrower nor a lender be, you would know in an instant that that was a clinker.
Hmm.
Ask yourself how you could know a thing like that before the end of the line actually occurred, which you could. How could you how could you know that?
Well, it's you said be neither a borrower nor a lender is the example.
Yeah.
So it begins be neither a yeah, it begins with a trochee and not an iamb. So that I think bothers me. And then be neither a borrower nor a lender. That it ends with a trochee as opposed to an iamb as well.
Yeah, but you know, when we got down to it, I could find you lines that began or end with trochees that are perfectly good.
That's true.
At the first Brook conference on poetic meter, this was way back there. I think maybe 91 or something, uh, at Manchester University. We had a whole bunch of linguists who studied poetry, all kinds of poetry. Uh, and our host, Chris McCulley, did some scrambled Shakespeare and in front of us as the audience. And, you know, every time he slipped in a clinker, we would go, meet in a small fraction of a second. All of us in unison. And then we would argue about why the line was no good. You see the problem?
Yeah.
The explanation.
Yeah.
So to me, it seemed that I could take the really hard parts of this problem and extract them from the study of poetic meter and put them back in Mr. Chomsky's in basket by saying, well, however the language works, the poetry imitates it.
Hmm.
And the hard parts are about how the human language faculty works.
Right.
This po the ability to contrive a poetic form that works in a particular language that, you know, can be apprehended by everybody in this kind of intuitive way, where you know whether the rules are being followed or not. That's based on the ability to learn a language really fast as a child. Once you have learned one language, you have this ability and you can tweak it. You can create, you know, toy words, toy phrases that are units of poetic meter, and you can use them and communicate them and understand them. So
Hmm.
that's the generative approach to language and the generative approach to meter.
Hmm. It reminds me of the anecdote that J.R.R. Tolkien once told of himself as a child when he wrote his first story, and he called it the Green Great Dragon. And he says that his mother had to sit him down and explain that you can't say the Green Great Dragon, you have to say the Great Green Dragon. And then he decided to give up on storytelling and become a philologist.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, I have to give Tolkien a shout out because his his typical verses by Treebeard are in perfect Old English poetry, and they are perfect word foot examples. They have
Oh,
two
no
words.
kidding.
If you look at them, they all scan yeah, as word foot meter in a very intricate and detailed way, which showed that as a talented uh, creative writer, he had a very strong grasp of the fundamentals behind poetic form
Hmm. Yeah, no
by
kidding.
intuition. I mean, he could do it. And he was a philologist, so if he'd thought about it, he might be able to explain it.
Hmm.
But all of his type C consist of, for example, an unstressed word and a three-syllable compound. And his type B,
Hmm.
instead of Sievers' example, which would have, you know, two trochees. He, like Travis, who intuited that words and feet are very carefully or very intricately related. Tolkien intuited that Old English is a word foot meter. He
Have you
clearly
ever,
got that.
yeah, have you ever tried composing Old English poetry?
Oh yeah.
Really? How
Yeah, I
much?
did a riddle.
Oh, you made a riddle.
Yeah, and the answer was computer, which
What,
shows that I'm not trying to put to create a forgery. No, ever since I was a kid, I've been writing poetry for fun.
mhm.
Uh, I've been a very fortunate person, and I have been subjected to so little unhappiness in my life, although I've had, some rocky bits, that I don't have anything interesting to say based on the experience, really severe experience of misfortune. So I make, birthday cards with acrostics and for people in my family and things like that. But I've always enjoyed learning foreign languages. And when I used to do that, before I had a wife and kids and had to get tenure and so forth, I would when I learned a language like Welsh or Irish, I would write a poem in it or translate a poem out of it, like Rilke's The Unicorn. When I was, oh, dieses ist das Tier, das es nicht gibt. This is the animal that doesn't exist. That was, or Walter von der Vogelweide's Unter den Linden. So I would translate these poems into the original rhyme and meter and whatever.
Uh-huh. So is
As
that
a
that's
way of consolidating my interest in learning foreign languages, which had everything to do with poetry.
that's a German poem you've just recited.
Yeah,
Is it a famous poem? I haven't heard it before.
which unter den Linden,
The
Walt's
animal das
poem or
nicht gibt.
Rilke's poem.
That one, yeah.
Oh yeah, it's called the Unicorn,
Hmm.
Einhorn, I guess in German.
Einhorn.
It's
That's
in
pretty
his
cool.
selected writings. It's beautiful.
Nice.
Um, yeah,
Can
I'll send you the Old English riddle if you like. Excuse me.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That would be
Yeah.
awesome. I could include it in the description, if you'd be okay with that. What word did you use for computer?
Oh, I it didn't use a word for computer. That was the answer.
Oh, that was just the answer.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've often
It's
wondered.
Wrēt līcu wundrum scīneð. A wondrous white shines brightly, so forth.
Nice. Okay, so word foot theory. I think it might be safe to say that a lot of viewers might not really know what that means. Could you kind of explain from a sort of a broad strokes perspective what is like the principle of word foot theory? What does it, and then what does it actually mean in terms of analyzing, for example, Beowulf?
Well, again, the principle is to explain poetic form. It helps to find something in the mind that it corresponds to. If you're going to have, if if you're going to divide, if you're going to say that a line of poetry consists of so many feet, uh, what do you mean by that? How can you prove that it does? Well, how can you prove that it does by showing that, say, most of the in most cases, you can divide the line into a certain number of units with the same uh, pattern of weak and strong prominence. And to do that, you have to think about the patterns of the words in the line. So conceptually, if it works out, which it does, uh, that you assume that if it works out to assume that words are based on feet, that your intuitions about English words are the ones you use when you divide a line into feet intuitively, then you know where the foot comes from. It comes from your intuitive idea of a word pattern, and you can test it against your intuitions. Could this be a weak, strong foot? Could a word like uh, blackbird be a weak, strong foot? No, it couldn't. If you align that with where a foot should be, causes complexity, and you can only do that at certain parts of the line and not in too close together, and all kinds of restrictions that Kiparsky discussed.
Mhm.
So basically, it's just you can explain how we can understand how we can divide a line of poetry into feet if we're doing it by using our intuitions about words. So, like, consider iambic pentameter. Why iamb? Well, we borrowed it from French. How do
Mhm.
French words go at the end of the phrase? As you can tell by rhyme.
Right.
Lycée, honneur. French doesn't have a strong stress, but it does have a phrasal stress. But the phrasal stress goes at the end of the word. So we have iambic words. Why do they work in English? We used to have trochaic words that, well, we lost the unstressed syllable at the end of most trochaic words, those inflectional syllables. Uh, we have some left, but now the what you call the four-letter Anglo-Saxon word is a monosyllable.
Mhm.
So now our predominant stressed word pattern is just a monosyllable. That doesn't have any rhythm.
Right.
That's useless to a poet. What are we going to use? We have to use a word group. Now, what happened to those words that lost the thing after the end of the word? They got turned into prepositions that are unstressed that go before the word. So all of a sudden, where you used to have monum, uh, you have to man or to men.
Mhm.
Monum, to men, turned around backwards. So that's why we could borrow this French thing where they had words that had actual patterns, weak, strong, and adapted to our smallest rhythmical unit, which is now phrases like two men, fits perfectly.
Right. And
And
that's what makes
and it
writing,
took hold, didn't it? I mean,
yeah.
well, Old English meter was probably traceable back to the shift to stress at the beginning of the word. That was like 300 BCE. So the meter was probably 1,000 years old when the Beowulf poet was using it.
Mhm.
We have an example um, uh, in runic uh, uh, Norse of a perfect line of poetry from about 300 of the current era. So we know for sure the meter was pretty much like the meter of Beowulf. That was there in the middle of Denmark, where about near where Hrothgar lived.
Yeah.
That meter was there in 300 of the current era. And there's every reason to believe that it's twice as old.
Mhm. I've written a bit of Old English rhyming verses for I
Uh-huh.
write like occasionally I'll write like songs in Old English on this YouTube channel, and it's so difficult to have an end rhyme in Old English because it's also difficult to write modern English in Old English verse. Auden, Tolkien, Lewis all did it rather well, but I found it very difficult. But I didn't consider that the reverse is also very difficult, writing Old English in modern English verse, because all of these inflections and things like having a stressed constituent at like on the rhyme is so rare. It's like every verse has to be like a B verse, that ends on a sort of a lift. And it's just very interesting to see that practical effect of the difficulty of kind of forcing the language into a meter that it's not really conducive to.
That was, I mean, one of the things you get if you try to write poetry like that in the language you're learning is you get a feeling for what these problems are. And I got some insight into that as I gradually worked up from feet and words to verses and phrases and lines and sentences. And in the book I just finished, it's very clear that the basic word order of poetry in Beowulf was subject, object, verb. Now, the thing about that is verbs are governors. They govern objects, and they do that in the way that prepositions do. Like you have to say of me, you can't say of I. Just like you have to say he saw me, not saw I.
Right.
The verb demands the object form for its object. And governors are generally lighter stressed than the words they govern. So if you have a subject object verb language, the verb is the least prominent word in a three-word sentence, less prominent than the subject or the object, if they're all stressed and so forth.
Hmm.
If you have a subject verb object language, the object has the greater stress. The word at the end has a greater stress than the word in the middle. So that's a rising rhythm in the verb phrase, right? So you get to see why this thing of the heavy words first in alliteration, and then toward the end of the poetic line, there's fewer and fewer places where you can put alliteration. And in iambic pentameter, the rhyme goes at the end. The words go strong, weak. The phrase goes strong, weak in a subject object verb language. In any uh, phrase, in strict, like Proto-Germanic or whatever, strict SOV, in any phrase, the first word is the strongest. In strict SVO, in any phrase, the second word is the strongest. This is going to create a whole bunch of problems in adapting an SOV meter like alliterative meter to a SVO language like modern English.
Hmm.
Everything's just in the wrong place. I would advise you, if you're going to do alliterative poetry in modern English, do a mirror image of the alliterative patterns in Old English and have the alliteration on the second word in the A
Mm.
verse and the B verse as the obligatory alliteration. You can do that. I actually had a poet who was talking to me about it uh, and had arrived at that independently.
Hmm.
Turn it around backwards. Or I guess he'd read something maybe about Tolkien's meter and just grabbed onto that and asked me a whole bunch of very intelligent questions about how to implement that in its practice.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think the two poems that I'm most familiar with in Old English are Beowulf and the Battle of Maldon, which makes it really interesting. When I read your book, I immediately was like, of course, these two poems are two sort of demonstrative examples of the changing language in the sense that in Beowulf, you get lines like Himtha Hildedeor Hofmodigra Torch Yitachte, that Yitachte comes all the way at the end of the sentence.
Mhm.
But then in the Battle of Maldon, you get sentences like Þāþær Byrhtnoth on Gon Beornas Trimian. Then Byrhtnoth began to sort of arrange the warriors. So in
Mhm.
that one, the verb is coming right after the subject. And it's so interesting because what is the Battle of Maldon? It has rhymes. It rhymes multiple times.
Mhm.
And so you have like Byrnoth mathalode, bord havanode, that kind of thing associated with this sort of the verb coming closer and closer to the subject is so interesting, to as almost like a hallmark of the changing language when compared to Beowulf a few centuries earlier. So fascinating.
Yeah, it's the shift from the weakly stressed verb at the end to the weakly stressed verb in the middle uh, gives you, when you get the more strongly stressed object out there at the end, then there's an impulse towards Ra. And it doesn't have anything to do with anybody's intentions. It's just, it sounds good
Mhm.
because the language is ready for it. And I don't know what we can tell about the ordinary conversation at the time that Beowulf was written, but I think it was probably quite a bit farther toward SVO than the poetic language.
Okay, yeah. So that was one thing that I wanted to ask about is let's say Beowulf is composed early 8th century Mercia. You would not say then that the word order in conversational early 8th century Mercian was SOV. You think it was more close to SVO?
Yeah, because this is an oral formulaic tradition.
Hmm.
I mean, there's a lot of argument about whether the Beowulf poet could read or not. Uh, but that's really irrelevant because there are people who can read who don't use it to compose poetry. When I do a sonnet, I sort of write down things on an envelope, but I do it mostly inside my head. It's short. If I were a trained formulaic poet, I would know all about ways to describe the kinds of characters that occur in heroic epic and know about all the scenes that occur, the ocean, the dark forest, all those cool liminal spaces. And I would be able to compose a poem without being able to read uh, by using those traditional formulas, which I had used. This is not something that you acquire like children acquire language. The ability to be an oral formulaic poet seems to have involved training by experts. So once you have that training, the system works, it's going to be conserved. The poets might have had very liberal ideas by our political standards, but they were linguistically very conservative because they had this old-fashioned thing that did the job. If it works, don't fix it. And um, so that's in any oral formulaic tradition, the language of oral formulaic poetry is going to be different from the language of ordinary conversation, sometimes quite different, often much more archaic. There are words in Homer that hadn't been used for a long time with very strange old shapes to them and so forth. That's all been studied by very clever classicists, and it's well known. And all kinds of archaic features in Beowulf. Like I don't think in when the Beowulf poet was talking to friends over a glass of beer, I don't think he would say things like Scandinavia instead of in Scandinavia, or
Shadowlandum in, yeah,
South Sweden, Shadalandum in. But
yeah,
in poetry, he still uses those postpositional phrases. And that, just like the verb object thing, or the object verb thing, the object preposition thing tends to happen in SOV languages. It's the governed prominent word followed by the weaker, less prominent governing word.
right.
So the thing, but the the work I've been doing on syntax, poetic syntax can be used to figure out things uh, in a relative sense. When Folk, for example, was talking about how to use uh, phonological sound archaisms to date Old English poetry, he didn't try to have absolute dates except on independent evidence. Uh, he was talking about the relative chronology from one poem to another, and it's pretty reliable for that. By the same token, even if the syntax of Beowulf was different from the syntax of ordinary conversation, you could expect a modernization to occur over the Old English period, which you detected between Beowulf and Malden.
Right.
Right? So you can get a relative chronology. So this makes it very unlikely that Beowulf was composed uh, by the person who wrote it down around 1000 CE.
Yeah, I've often seen a lot of argument over how strictly we should be paying attention to these poems as sort of testaments to the language. And I think the Battle of Maldon is a really interesting example because it almost seems like the poet was a sort of revolutionary in the sense that poems not too far behind him were extremely conservative, and it almost seems like he decided to break from a lot of these traditions where take like the Battle of Brunanburg, which might have been only 50 years prior, is extremely conservative in comparison, which suggests to me at least that the poet of the Battle of Brunanburg was attending to a lot of really archaic features of the meter.
Yes, I agree with you. And I think if you look at what is called, I think inaccurately, rhetorical prose instead of poetry, Alfrich's alliterative texts, you can see Alfrich is a kind of Whitman. He's a he's a preacher. He wants to reach an audience of ordinary people. He can't do that with a very aristocratic and archaic diction.
Right, good point.
So, and the Malden poet seems to have that same impulse, that revolutionary thing. The language is changing. It's getting harder and harder to reach ordinary people with it, which means it's not going to do what it used to do in uh, 300 BCE and down to, the Beowulf poet's time. It's not going to carry, it's not going to be the guarantor of preservation for all of the important cultural things in a pre-literate culture. Laws, myths, wise sayings.
Hmm.
Uh, that's what oral formulaic poetry did. It helped people who were very dispersed maintain a culture over a wide geographical area that was discontinuous, full of barriers. Uh, but the thing is, literacy made that less and less necessary. You could have a center of power with people who could write things down and preserve them that way. Uh, so the need for conservatism is less obvious. It's now almost exclusively uh, something that would enable you to improvise, to be an oral formulaic poet. And in that function, I think it survives as late as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. I think there are people who could compose really good poetry by ear, whether they could improvise it in real time or had to work it out bit by bit, the way Cadman did, go home,
Right.
think about it, come back and recite it. I don't know that. Uh, I suspect it was more like Cadman.
Hmm.
Go home, take a chunk, have have somebody read to you or read, if you can read, a chapter of Genesis, go home, think about it, come back, perform it.
Right.
Um, so, and this only lasts until SOV dies,
Hmm.
a little after the Gawain poet composed.
Right. So,
Then it's out of the question. Then it's totally dysfunctional.
right.
Although Shakespeare does use verb final for poetic reasons, neither a borrower nor a lender be,
Hmm.
even if nobody was talking that way. Still, the basic structure of this is not the basic word order of his poetry. It's an exceptional word order used to get the meter right. And as Gil Humans showed in an article in Language, Shakespeare just does this verb final stuff when it's necessary.
Hmm.
Otherwise, he uses SVO order.
I've heard arguments that Shakespeare and Milton does it too a lot, this verb final, that's Latin influence. Would you agree with that, or do you think that that's just sort of this archaic
I
reflexive
think
of?
it's an inheritance of uh, uh, native
Hmm.
tradition that's just a couple of hundred years older.
Right.
Folklore in Shakespeare's time was full of verb final stuff. Latin is an SOV language, but it's and it's not it's like English in that prepositions tend to come before nouns. It has some enclitics like quay and stuff. But a really consistent SOV language would be like Japanese, which has postpositions.
Hmm.
Uh, the comes before, instead of the man, you have man, the, instead of men, you have men of, and so forth.
Like
Very,
in Icelandic.
yeah.
Well, okay. So I do want to real quick give a sort of basic overview of word foot theory for the sake of viewers, in the sense
Can we
that
call it universalist theory?
sure, sure, yeah, universalist theory then.
Because the latest book is about getting syntax into the theory.
Okay.
So it's not just words, it's phrases. And also I go back to the smaller level in deriving some rules for metrical positions.
Okay, universalist theory then,
Yeah.
in the sense that of
Syllable theory, word theory, and phrase theory, and sentence theory.
okay, um, for this, in the sort of the practical application for the student of meter, they would look at a verse like in Jardarum and scan that as 2 feet, one syllable unstressed in, if I'm understanding
Mhm.
correctly, and then Jardarum would be a 3 position foot that is stress, half stress, unstress. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yeah.
So then that scan would be those 2 feet together in one pattern. How would we approach something like wītōmes, where we have 3 words?
Well, um, if you have feet that correspond to words and you don't allow for throwing in extra unstressed syllables, your meter is going to be very restrictive. The
Hmm.
Irish meters that require exactly two stressed words in every half line, they're alliterative meters. They're a lot like Old English meter, except you can't throw in any, you have to have just the two stressed words. Any two stressed words will do as long as you repeat the same rhythmical pattern at least once. But the poems in these are just usually nomic lists or tiny little sentences with a subject and a verb in asyndetic parataxis, not complex sentences.
Hmm. That's
Terribly
similar
inefficient.
to Middle Welsh, right?
Say again?
I think that's the same case in most Middle Welsh poetry. Am I correct in remembering that?
Well, there are some Middle Welsh poems that are like that, but they're much less obviously so than the Irish ones.
Hmm.
Um, so you can't be a storyteller and use that poetry. So you have to get some way of actually allowing all the kinds of unstressed words that are necessary to narrate. Beowulf, the thing you do to keep the word foot structure clear is that you very carefully define the places where you can throw in an unstressed word. And you mentioned the thara impsitandra.
Hmm.
The thara is no good. How
Hmm.
do you know it's no good? Well, actually, I count things. I use Excel to count things. It's much easier for me than it was for Sievers using index cards because I can access any feature of anything and see how it correlates with the other ones. Piece of cake takes 2 sentences instead 2 seconds instead of 2 years. But one of the things, if you look at where you have a definite article or demonstrative like thara of the in you have it 200 times in types B and C
Hmm.
where it shares the opening of the verse with other unstressed words.
Hmm.
The thing about thara impsitandra is that that's a type D verse.
Right.
And that verse could be a verse all by itself without thara. Okay? So the thing is that the words like thara, definite article demonstrative, the though words or that words, they occur 200 times in verses that would be unacceptable if all of the unstressed words were removed. And once in a verse that would be acceptable if all of the so you see 200 to 1. What are the odds? Nobody noticed that
Right.
because nobody actually counted what up all the places where you can stick the words. So that shows you there are very strong restrictions on where you can throw in these extra words. And that forces me to say that those words are extrametrical
Hmm.
in that they lie outside the metrical pattern. They don't count. You have to restrict them to show whether they count or not. So if you have, instead of thara impsitanda, if you have a type A1 verse with an unstressed syllable before it, you know what that unstressed syllable is going to be. What is it going to be?
Like yay or something like that, right?
A prefix,
Hmm.
almost always. If not a prefix, something very much like a prefix, like a negative particle.
Hmm.
These are the these are the most high frequency, low prominence words in the language. The poet doesn't like to use them as feet all by themselves because they
Right.
have such low prominence. You're getting into the area of unstressed syllables can be more or less prominent because they're more or less predictable. The ones with the lower frequencies are okay as feet because they're prominent enough,
Hmm.
like prepositions, independent function words. Where that would cause confusion if you had an unstressed word that was prominent enough to be a foot in front of something that could be a verse by itself, because then that would look like 3 feet.
Right.
And there is a hard and fast rule, 2 feet, no 3 feet.
Hmm.
So the long story short, the poet has a way of telling you whether the word counts as a foot or not.
Hmm.
And that's that trick, whether it was discovered by one genius or by a tradition over the years with lots of poets involved, I have no idea, but it was a really good trick. By placing more or less prominent unstressed words in particular positions and hardly any otherwise, the message gets sent intuitively to the audience. And the
Mhm.
audience can tell, well, we have 4 or 5 unstressed words. That's only going to count as 1 foot
Mhm.
because if we and it's actually useful to add these unstressed words because if you have 3 in a row, you know that's got to be 1 foot. It can't be an anacrusis.
Right. It's too,
So
yeah, it's too much.
you know you're in type A3, A type B, type C. That's why you know yourself how if you were required to have a test on Old English meter, that's how you could tell. You knew that by intuition, just the way you came to know how to pronounce the plural S.
Hmm. And that's, I think, a way in which, unfortunately, I think Tolkien was a bit behind. He just wasn't born late enough. In the beginning of his commentary on Beowulf, he refers to wiht as genuine anacrusis. And I don't know what you have to say on that, but I've read a bit about the syntax of the usage of the word wiht, and I think that that's genuinely just not anacrusis at all. I think that's just part of the unstressed beginning of that C-type verse.
Uh, yeah, except there is a way to formulate that without using the word anacrusis. And uh, whet, I never found whet used. You occasionally find prefixes used as feet.
Hmm.
The poet avoids it, but it does occur, and especially when at Madrid, like yeah, hot and fela. Okay,
Hmm.
but I never found whet used as a foot all by itself.
There's an interesting article about it. Have you read? I think it was Walkden wrote an article about the syntax of wiht in I think 2014.
I
Um,
just, wow, I haven't read that. I've got to read that. I'm just using an article about unexpressed subjects by him. That's very good.
yeah, he's quite a good scholar.
Uh,
I'll have to send it to you. It's online. It's open
thank you
access.
very much. Yes.
But anyway, so you mentioned earlier something that I think it might be helpful to provide an example for this idea that thāra appears in verses where it's necessary for the verse type. So if I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but if we had, for example, thāra gārdena, you can't have gārdena as its own verse. It's just 1 foot. And so you need the thāra gārdena in that hypothetical verse. But
Hmm.
in imsitendra is, correct me if I'm wrong, it is 1 foot, but it satisfies a pattern
No,
or
Imsitantra is 2 feet.
right, because sitendra. Okay, so that scans as 2 feet then.
Yeah, you can, uh, the being able to throw in the extra unstressed words you need to narrate is just one of the wrinkles that the tradition had to solve. The other one is it going to be is the compound going to be 1 foot or 2 feet?
Two
Uh,
or no.
yeah, well, they differ. Middenjerdis is 2 feet.
Uh-huh.
Uh, Imsitendra is 2 feet. Imb, type D, Imsitendra.
Right.
So the wrinkle, the fudge factor you're allowed to use is you can have the 2 feet divided not by a word boundary, but by the boundary between a compound, which would be, a strong internal boundary that would have, the generativists would put a hash mark there rather than
Hmm.
uh, just a syllable division. Uh, now the rule, Yeah, so imagine yourself as the god of poetry or something who invents the poem, like
Hmm.
Bragi the Old or whatever, who was apotheosized by Snorri. Okay, you have your artistic material, these words. You have, and they're different sizes. And you have to decide which is going to be 2 feet compounds, compounds are going to be 2 feet and which are going to be 1 feet. Now, if you look at mid-Anierdas, it's made up of two trochaic constituents,
Hmm.
and each one can actually appear as a separate word. This is the most common word pattern in the language. This is going to be 2 feet because there's a rule that said if you can use it as a foot, you can't use it as a verse.
Right.
So you got to decide, is it going to be a foot? Is this compound going to be 1 foot or 2 feet? It's going to be 2 feet if the constituent words are more common than the compound pattern.
So then
And
me.
also because a foot is more simply expressed as a word than as a compound.
Hmm.
But if it's in a case like Siebenjedrift,
Right.
that has 4 syllables. It's been a problem for metrists to say that this is to explain why this is not an acceptable verse, because it has 4 metrical positions. Of course, there's some attempt to say it doesn't really have 4, or it's not, but
But this
I
is
don't
where
think it's
your
word.
overlap restriction comes in.
Yeah, that's right. Now, that's a very rare type of compound. Uh, and so why it should be a word rather than a verse is a tricky thing to explain. But the reason why it needs to be a foot is that it's very closely related to words like Sibjedrift
Hmm.
or um, Handjewerk or words with a trochaic constituent,
Uh-huh.
Middanjerd,
Yeah.
right? You couldn't tell the difference. If you allowed Sibjedrift to be a verse, it would be hard to distinguish it. It would be hard to, there was probably dialectal variation between Sibjedrift and Sibjedrift.
Right.
You wouldn't be able to tell. Now, the thing is, the rule says Sibjedrift could be a verse if there was no overlap.
Hmm.
Uh, and it can be in Old Norse.
Right. Yeah. So we do see that verse type in Old
Yeah,
Norse poetry.
yeah. The argument works, but it. I mean, I'm trying to do things in a reasonably short period of time.
Right.
We could go through that in greater detail if we needed to.
Yeah, I
Um,
guess a personal question that I had when reading the syntax of Beowulf was about words like håndgestalla or nidgestalla that we find in Beowulf, where
mhm.
the uninflected form, being a weak noun, does seem to have overlap with this A type on off on off. And I guess my question would be, why does that not incur overlap where Sibbe does? Is it because you don't have that sort of ambiguous auditory factor?
Um, Nidjastella is acceptable as type A because you're filling the first foot with a word group that has the same pattern as a trochaic word.
Okay.
And because the boundary between the prefix, oh, the boundary between the prefix and the stressed word that it's attached to is the very much stronger than in modern English.
Hmm.
It's more like the boundary between a preposition and the and the word the preposition modifies. It's not as closely bound as it would be in a modern English word like behold,
Hmm.
where really it's part of the word. We have written Germanic and Gothic from 300 of the current era or so.
Hmm.
And then in Gothic, you can find the prefix separated from the root by other words. So I treat the prefix as a word, but not as a word that makes a very good foot.
Okay.
But it does, its ideal placement is as a substitute for an unstressed inflectional ending in a foot realized as a word group.
Hmm.
It's great for that because that should be non-prominent. That's not a foot by itself. That's a subcomponent of a foot.
Uh-huh.
Subcomponent of a foot should be weaker than a foot.
Hmm. Okay, that makes sense. I don't want to hold you for too long. I do have one thing in particular that I really would like to ask you, given, your extensive work on the subject and especially this kind of landmark book. It really deals with sort of the inner workings of the poem. So I wanted to ask you, what do you imagine to have been the sort of creative process of the Beowulf poet? That is, how can you describe how he or she comes up with these verses?
Uh, well, that's the part I dumped into Mr. Chomsky's in basket.
For
That's
sure.
like, how is it that a child can learn language so fast? But it's not quite the same kind of learning. Um, it's more like learning to be a jazz musician or a blues musician. There, there are jazz musicians who can read music, and there are others who can't.
Hmm.
But there doesn't appear to be a big difference. So it's the question you asked me is like asking me how did Dave Brubeck get to be such a good jazz improviser that he impressed all of his music theory teachers in graduate school
Hmm.
without being able to read music. He couldn't read music and he had to go take a course in how to read music to get his degree in music because the president of the university refused to. He had to go back and become a square. uh, and then there's Errol Garner, who never bothered to learn to read music because he didn't need to.
Hmm.
So it is possible uh, to develop what is called automatic facility, but it requires a lot of work. I mean, if you think jazz is just like warbling your native wood notes, you don't know anything. Charlie Parker, when he was gonna improvise on a standard tune, he would begin by playing the melody in 12 keys every time. And that's just part of what he did.
That is, he would play it and then change the key, play it again, change the key, play it again 12 times.
Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah, and without writing anything down.
Huh. That's
He
pretty
could read
crazy.
music. I mean, most of the great jazz musicians, Thomas Waller, aka Fats, uh, had been trained by very intelligent composers who are only now having their orchestral works performed.
Hmm.
I think Fats Waller was a student of James P. Johnson. They were good students. They worked as hard as any graduate student in music to
Hmm.
learn how to do serious jazz.
Hmm.
Um, it's a little easier to become a blues musician. Um, before my lips started giving me trouble, I could play harmonica.
I was about to ask if you played an instrument.
Yeah. Oh, I played jazz on the piano now. My Boolean algebra TA who taught me music theory on the guitar, electric guitar.
Huh.
I played jazz guitar for a while. But then my kids started, I stopped gigging. I had a family. Uh, my kids started taking Suzuki. So my sister's a piano teacher. She taught me how to how to go back to playing the piano, which I'd played as music lessons as a child.
Right.
And so I started using Bud Powell's system where you play the tonic and the seventh, the shells in the left hand and put the third and the fifth in the melody,
Hmm.
which is easy on your hands as you grow older. And
Yeah.
also just the simplification of the left hand. It's easy to get automatic facility with your left hand
Hmm.
because your little fingers are doing the bass line
Right.
and your thumb is sort of mechanically connected.
Hmm.
And it frees up your right hand for the solo, for
Right.
creating a solo.
Hmm.
But I don't practice enough to actually do this in public. I just do it for my amusement. I arrange a piece in this style, and then if I play it once through without making a mistake, then I go on.
Hmm. Well, I mean that's a pretty cool insight though on, sort of oral formulaic poetry, comparing it to jazz. I'd never thought to do that before.
Well, I didn't when I learned how to improvise blues with a harmonica. I didn't think about the notes at all. It was
Hmm.
all perfectly mechanical. None of my literary skills were involved in this.
Hmm.
Just the ear, just listening to Jimmy Reed and Little Walter. And
Right. There's one more thing. Actually, I apologize that I forgot I needed to ask you. I promised a friend that I would ask this question. In your book, in the syntax of Beowulf, you mention a rule of metrical subordination. I think it's OE
Mhm.
6.2, and it dictates that the off verse is subordinate to the on verse. What might this mean with regard to the performance of a sentence that begins in the off verse? And I'm very interested in your thoughts on the performance of Beowulf, that is, before an audience in general. But if the off verse is subordinate to the on verse, but we have such stressed beginnings to sentences, how does that sort of work?
Well, in the at the level of the word in an SOV language with inflections, the first syllable, the second syllable is subordinated to the first syllable
Hmm.
in a shadowlandum in a postpositional phrase. So within the sentence, it seems likely that the verb phrase is subordinated to the subject. Uh,
Okay.
that would be linguistic. You would
Hmm.
have to, if you wanted to have an authentic pronunciation of the poem, you might need to talk to somebody who speaks Japanese.
Oh yeah.
Talk to Juntaro Sawa or somebody. Um, I'm not sure that the verb phrase was subordinate to the uh, subject, but it's clear that if you think of the line as a large compound,
Hmm.
it's going to be left-right subordination everywhere,
Hmm.
metrical subordination. Now, this doesn't necessarily, I did an article for JEGP, which, oh, I can give you the reference now.
Oh, awesome.
April 2022. On the difference between rhythm and meter in poetry,
Okay.
the the basic idea is Pope was right about rhythm and Sievers was right about meter,
Hmm.
and they're independent. Music theory is our most fully developed science of aesthetic form by far.
Hmm.
Uh, and there's a wonderful exposition of rhythm in a book by the leading cognitive scientist, not just the linguistics, Chomsky's the leader, but when you talk about working David Marr's work on vision and all kinds of other modalities, uh, pressure, feeling.
Hmm.
Ray Jackendorf is the one who's interested in cognitive sciences of all kinds, not just linguistics. Uh, but he's a world-class clarinetist, and he wrote a book with Fred Lerdahl, who was the chair of the music theory professor at Yale at the time. So these are guys who really know what they're doing. They wrote a book called A Generative Theory of Tonal Meter.
Hmm.
And in that, it's very clear that a theory of rhythm is a theory of uh, that presupposes as the basic principle an equal distance between beats,
Hmm.
beats being rhythmical units. Uh, and a theory of meter is a theory of restrictions on how you can place linguistic constituents,
Okay.
which is and in the Irish examples of uh, meters where you must have two stressed words, but they can have any pattern so long as you repeat it, or the ones where you must have six stressed words in the line, and they can be any pattern, and that's the only restriction. This shows that that's not a rhythmical rule
Hmm.
because the rhythms are different and they're totally unregulated by rule.
Hmm.
But the requirement that you should have a certain number of words is regulated by a rule. It's not rhythmical.
Hmm.
So this article is called On the Difference Between Rhythm and Meter in Poetry. There are two different systems. One is based on equal distances between rhythmical units called beats, and the other is uh, a system that separates the sheep from the goats, what
Hmm.
linguistic patterns are acceptable as poetic lines.
Right.
The two things have to be Lerdahl and Jackendorf talk about you have to find the rhythm that matches uh, the acoustic input you're receiving, the one that comes closest.
Hmm.
And what is called syncopation exists because it's very boring if you have this exactly the same rhythm all the time.
Yeah.
You have to have little deviations.
Right.
So it's a problem. You have some acoustic input, whether it's musical or poetic, and you have to assign a rhythm to it. You have to find one that matches it normally, and in which departures from it are identifiable as occasional wrinkles for variety. Once you find it, it sticks. You can't stop hearing it that way.
Hmm.
That's what they claim. So, as applied to Old English meter, this the rhythm strong, weak for the verse,
Hmm.
that corresponds to two words with the most common pattern, and that's because they have the most common pattern, that's why they're so frequent.
Hmm.
And that matches 4/4 time or any duple time
Right.
perfectly. once you start hearing the poetry that way, then you hear types B and C as syncopations,
Mhm.
which, as Pope correctly pointed out, would have a rest instead of a strong beat.
Mhm.
That's a pretty radical kind of syncopation, but as Lerdoff and Jackendorf say, it's not regular enough or persistent enough to overcome the, what did he call it? The sort of dictatorial power of the type A1 pattern.
Yeah, right.
So as far as performance is concerned, um, I think if you wanted to make the off verse more prominent than the on verse a little bit, I think you could do that, or the same prominence.
Mhm.
That is, I don't think you, I don't see any linguistic reason at present why the subject should be more prominent than the object. Maybe that's the way it is in SOV languages. I just don't happen to know. I haven't
Makes
found
sense.
any. I haven't found any guidance from the people who do typology, who study, the relation between prominence and word order.
Mhm. Well, that is all the time we have. Professor Russom, thank you very much for coming on the channel.
Yeah, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Hey, thanks for watching that interview. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. If you like content like this, be sure to check out the rest of the channel and kindly consider becoming a supporter on Patreon or subscribing. Until next time, þēah, Yesunde.